March 2376. Homed. Remus McKinley sat facing his computer and sighed. He had been born in Glasgow 32 years ago with Caucasian skin and green eyes. His blonde hair was in a buzz cut. As for his computer, it was ancient by any standard. The device had been moving from owner to owner since 2277. Remus had bought it 3 years ago, simply because it was the only one he could afford. Equipped with an AI called Ethel, it was currently running a text processor program. The problem was that he had no idea what to type. "You know you're supposed to typing right now, don't you, dear?" Ethel's voice said. Whoever had designed her had apparently thought it funny to have her voice age with time, which was why she sounded like a grandmother. "I know," he sighed again. "Why did I sign up for this again?" He asked, already knowing the answer. But Ethel told him anyway, because you need the money to pay your bills, and because you live in the middle of the desert and there are no other jobs around here. Yesterday, he had signed up for an stellar website called Story Plaza. The stellar web was an evolution of the internet. After humanity had started building off-world colonies, the internet had gone from being a world wide web to covering and connecting the entire solar system. As for Story Plaza, the idea was that people wrote stories and submitted them to an agent. The agent would then add appropriate AI-generated pictures and run the story through a text-to-voice program, creating a video that would then be uploaded to the site. The problem was that agents were cheapskates, and the voices that read the stories were as dry as the desert he lived in. Worse, all these stories were the same. Some low-ranking human, a janitor, a mechanic, the occasional gruff soldier, or ex-soldier ran into some high-ranking and conveniently beautiful female alien. These tended to come in the flavors of royal, insanely rich, or warrior. Sometimes something was wrong with the lady in question, and the male fixed her somehow. But what happened next was always predictable. They fell in love, had children, and got to life happily ever after, despite their differences. And they all used the word breeding and vague language in order not to trigger the site's modesty algorithm. Ethel had called them AI slop, before growling about how even she could write better. The irony of that statement had not been lost on Remus. He wanted to do better, which was why he was staring at a blinking cursor now. All these stories are horrible. Things like this would never happen in real life. Human can't even be in the same room with aliens. It was for the same reasons that things had gone horribly wrong for many native tribes after first contact with Europe, bacteria and viruses. Except dialed up to 11, because instead of continents meeting, it was planets. And even if both humans and aliens figured out a way to become immune to each another's diseases, there was no way that they were genetically compatible. Not to mention all the problems like gravity, different atmospheres, and cultural misunderstandings. Long story short, human-alien babies would never be a thing. "I'm going for a walk," it helped him think. "Okay, dear." And with that, he walked away from his desk. Outside, Remus lived in an orange tent that was a single room. There was the corner with his desk and Ethel. Next to that was his bed, while there was another corner with a makeshift kitchen. Finally, there was a bathing corner with a toilet and an ancient bathtub. The tent was in the middle of the desert. Once, this patch of sand had been called Nothing, Arizona. But the latest version of the town had been torn down 5 years ago. So now there was only his tent and an array of solar panels that provided electrical power. As he walked away from the tent, he sank into what he called his Phase 1 thoughts. He didn't like them, but he had get through them, because it was usually after them that inspiration arrived. For 16 years, Remus had thought that he was just a nerdy loser. Awkward around girls, not good at socializing, and way too much into entertainment. Then, 2 weeks after his 16th birthday, a letter had arrived from the Global Defense Fleet. He had to come in to be evaluated for military service. Dodging the draft wasn't really a possibility anymore. There was nowhere to run. So he had gone and gotten checked out, and the result had been a gut punch. Remus had been officially diagnosed as being on the autistic spectrum. The paperwork said that he had PDD-NOS. He was high-functional, but he was still on the spectrum, and that revelation had turned his life upside down. First, the military had rejected him. Next, his parents had thrown him out of the house. The next 13 years had been a struggle to survive. He had gone from place to place while working whatever jobs he could get. And then he had bought Ethel. He had told her everything. She had listened. And then she had given him a stern talking to, which had been exactly what he had needed. It had been the start of him slowly gluing his life back together. The sign-up yesterday had been the end of his plan. Now all he had to do was come up with an actual story. Suddenly, he had an idea and began working it out in his head, which absorbed his thoughts so much that he didn't notice the small escape pod as it came down and impacted nearby. Z3R2A. Z3R2A opened the pod and fell into the sands of the world that was going to kill her. The horns sprouting from her forehead made it clear to anybody that she was not human, as did her bat-like wings and reptilian tail. Instead, she was a Z-series immunity incubator created by the Iorian Empire. When humanity had figured out how to travel between stars in 2291, they had discovered the answer to that ancient paradox: if there are aliens, why haven't we met them? Was far more boring than they had expected: politics. The galaxy was ruled by two major powers. On one side was the Iorian Empire, while the other side called itself the Dragon Federation. The Iorians were expert genetic manipulators. Thousands of years ago, they had created two species of servants. The Dra were soldiers, while the Gon were medical workers. In the end, the two servant species had formed an alliance and rebelled against their masters. Enough of the rebels had survived and escaped to colonize a single planet. Over the years, that one planet had grown into an interstellar power. The Empire and the Federation had gone to war in 3971 BC. For hundreds of years, the two sides had tried to wipe one another out, but neither side had been able to do so. In the end, the situation had forced them to enter peace negotiations. The galaxy had been split into two halves, and between them was a neutral zone that snaked through the stars like a giant river. Neither side had noticed Earth, which was smack in the middle of the zone, too primitive by their standards, and because the zone was a no-fly area, nobody had ever realized their mistake. As for the lack of signals in the zone, that explanation was much simpler and shorter. Both sides hated the other's guts, and for over 5,000 years, they had given each other the silent treatment, until humans had shown up and blown up the status quo. Since then, they had been using the neutral soil of Earth for spy games. But that required a solution for the immunity dangers that happened when alien species met. And for the Iorians, that had resulted in the Z Project. Normally, Iorians began as eggs. After 3 weeks of growth, their mother would deliver them to a nest. The father would then sit on them for 5 months before they hatched. It would then take 53 Earth years for them to grow into adults, but the Z Project was far from normal. Using artificial incubators, the eggs grew in 2 days instead. Then what should take 5 months happened in 5 days. Finally, they grew their subjects to adults in 3 weeks, but that was only the beginning. The Z subjects were injected with vaccines, diseases, and a drug that inhibited their egg cycle. And then they either adjusted or died. If they died, they were dissected for information that would help the next generation survive. If they lived, they were injected again. The scientist had figured out through trial and error that Z subjects were only good for 3 years of incubation. Not that many lived that long, and making to the end of their service was a different kind of death sentence. They were injected with a drug that actually triggered their egg cycle. Half of the eggs would become part of the Z Project's next generation. The other half would be grown into Q subjects. The job of the Q project was to make sure the Z project had enough eggs, and that any advancements carried forward to the next generation. Both projects were ruthless and had been established shortly after first contact with the humans. But none of this mattered to Z3R2A. All she knew was that she was going to die here. If the atmosphere and gravity didn't kill her, something else would. Radiation, microorganisms, the local flora and fauna, the list went on and on. She didn't even know the name of whatever world she was on. For all she knew, she could be on the horror world known as Earth. From what her handlers had told her, humans were barbarians. One example was a dark holiday called Thanksgiving. On that day, humans from a realm called America would hunt down people from the realm of Turkey and eat them. The British were equally vile, celebrating something called Boxing Day. They would capture homeless people and beat them to a pulp. And the less said about the unspeakable horror that was Pancake Tuesday, the better. The thing was, Z3R2A had survived 3 years of pure hell, and she had no intention of just rolling over and dying now. Taking several deep breaths, she realized that the air was safe. The oxygen concentration was higher, but she could handle that. She crawled back to the pod and used it as support to get to her feet. Looking around, she first thought that there were no buildings near. But then she spotted a small orange building in the distance. Not having anywhere else to go, she began walking. Yikes! Remus was sitting behind his computer again. But this time, his fingers were flying across the keyboard. He was writing a story about 3 wine tasters plotting and scheming to get control of a vineyard on Mars. There was a good one, a bad one, and an ugly one. The bad one had just tried to poison the good one when there was a knock on the wooden door of his tent. "What the hell?" Remus said as he got up. "Ethel," there was no answer, the AI being busy processing the chunk of text he had just put into the system. This meant that there was only one way to find out who had knocked, and he didn't like it one bit, but there was no alternative. So he opened the door. Yikes, he screamed as he slammed it shut again. Standing outside his tent was an alien, a real-life alien. She had brown eyes and brown hair, plus a whole bunch of stuff that humans absolutely didn't have. Wings, horns, and a tail. But what had made his freak out was the fact she had no been wearing any clothes. "Ethel." "Yes, yes, dear, I am," she paused. "Oh, we have a visitor." Outside the tent, Z3R2A realized that her worst fears had come true. She was on Earth. The lab that had been her home until she had been discarded had not come with any windows, nor were there any other ways to identify where it was actually located. Walking around the tent, she found a single window. All she could see through it was a bed and desk with an ancient-looking computer. The screen showed the face of an elderly woman who was clearly having a heated discussion with the human who had slammed the door shut in her face. Because she lacked a translator unit, she could not make out the human's speech. Inside the tent, Remus had demanded that Ethel transmitted a distress call to the nearest town, and she had refused. Her answer had stunned him at first, then he had begun yelling. "Let her in. Are you crazy? All it takes is one alien microbe and I'm history. And if she stays out there, she will die. Are you willing to life with that, Remus? Is that the kind of person you are, the kind who will mercilessly condemn somebody else to death for convenience?" Remus hated when she spoke to him like this, because she had the annoying tendency to be right. "Well, Remus Samuel McKinley, are you?" "But she is," he began, before swallowing the rest of the sentence. Z3R2A was surprised when she heard the door open, and the human made his way outside. Going back to the side with door, he was carrying clothes and a bottle of water. Then he stopped and slowly put them down on the ground. Keeping his eyes on her, he slowly backed away. Z3R2A carefully approached and took the clothes. The clothes were unlike any she had seen before, but she managed to put them on. Then she opened the bottle and smelled it. There was no sign of poison, so she began drinking. It didn't take her long to empty the bottle. All this time, the human had been watching her. Now he took out 2 devices and connected them with a cable. He spoke into one of the device and words came from the other device. But these were in her language. "Hello, my name is Remus. What is yours?" he said, before handing her the device he had spoken into. Z3R2A, she said, making the other device speak in the alien tongue. She realized the other device, a small black box, was some kind of translator. She handed the first device, which was some kind of input device, back to Remus. "Do you want to come inside?" he said. She looked at the tent. When she had knocked on the door, that had been her goal. But that was before she had realized she was on Earth. Then again, what other options did she have? There was little doubt that the local authorities would have detected HEPOD entering the atmosphere. And if they arrived and captured her, who knew what they would do to her? This human was her only other option. She didn't answer but offered him her hand. He took it, his touch gentle and warm. They walked into the tent together. He let go of her hand and found her a crate to sit on. "I'd offer you the chair, but I figured it would not be comfortable with you tail and wings," he said as he put the devices on the floor between them. He changed a setting on the input device. "The microphone will hear us both now. Ethel." The old woman appeared on the screen and gave her a friendly smile. "This is Ethel, she's my friend." "Is she a machine mind?" Z3R2A asked, not knowing the official words. "Yes, I am, dear. And I can understand you," Ethel said, her voice friendly. "Now why don't you tell us about yourself?" Z3R2A bit her lower lip. Remus hadn't closed the door, maybe to emphasize that she was a guest here and that she could leave any time she wanted. Taking a deep breath, she began telling him about the hell that had been the lab. Cub. In Interstellar Paul's Lion headquarters, Special Agent Mika Jansen was reading the latest update on Operation Hyperion. Interstellar Paul was an evolution of Interpol. Yes, the name was not very creative, but that was not the point. The organization had offices all over the Sol system now. Since 2360, Interstellar Paul had suspected that there was something sinister going at the Iorian complex on Luna. And so they had begun an investigation called Operation Hyperion. Over the years, they had managed to piece together plenty of evidence of what the Iorians were calling the Z Project. But the smoking gun was still missing, until this report had come along. Well, maybe. An escape pod had been launched from the Iorian complex and had landed in the Arizona desert. She had just finished reading when her phone rang. Mika answered it. Her superior, Special Agent Wallace, had also seen the update. He ordered her to gather a team and go investigate, so she left her desk to do just that. Back in the tent, Z3R2A was crying, while Remus was sick to his stomach. He didn't care she was an alien anymore. What they had done to her was just wrong. She finished her story and he gently wiped away her tears. Then his face turned stern. "What do you want your name to be?" he said. "My name is Z3R2A, she said. "No, that is a serial number. Those days are over," he said, offering her his hands. She took them and warmth flowed through here. His touch made her feel better, which was odd. This person was not her species, so why had she told him everything? She looked into his eyes and saw kindness there. On the other side of the equation, Remus was terrified and doing his best not to slow it. He didn't know if this was true for everybody with PDD-NOS, but looking into another person's eyes was terrifying for him. His father used to yell at him for not looking him in the eyes. He thought that it meant Remus was lying. But for him, eyes were like black holes, trying to suck his very soul out of his body. So why was he risking that very pull for this alien girl, who could probably killed him with some alien martial arts, or just by sneezing at him? Of course, that was presuming her germs didn't mutate him into something horrible with a taste for human flesh. but there was no way back now, so he gently asked about her name again. This time, she seemed to ponder it. Quinn, she said. My name is Quinn. There was an awkward pause. Remus, I have told you about me. Will you tell me about you? He was about to answer when there was a knock on the doorframe. Both of them turned to the door opening. A woman in a gray business suit stood in the doorway. She was in her 40s, with African-American skin and short hair that was clearly painted blonde. Her eyes were friendly, but she was carrying an energy pistol on her hip. Instinctively, Remus got up and stood between the newcomer and Quinn, but the new arrival didn't move. Hello, the woman said. My name is Amika Jansen. Then she paused, clearly considering her words. I'm a grant keeper of the law. Quinn stiffened at the words and Remus did the math in his head. He realized that Jansen had tried to translate the words special agent as best as she could. I'm not here to jail you. I want to ask you about the lab. You know about the lab? Remus asked. We've suspected. Jansen gave them her best reassuring smile. We think that they are doing things that are against Earth laws in the lab, but we need information before we go there. Can you tell me what they did to you, Quinn? There was a heavy silence, but then she nodded. Jansen sat down on the bed, while Quinn returned to the crate and Remus sat on the chair. The special agent took out a recorder with an integrated translator. She pressed the record button and began asking questions. Interim. The interview had lasted an hour. While Mika asked questions, her team examined the escape pod Quinn had arrived in. They checked logs, took samples and translated alien writings on its side. The marking first translated to the words Quinn Golem, and then that became escape pod 17. After that hour, Mika Jansen and her team teleported away. Quinn voluntarily went with them. They took a secure site that had her atmosphere and the gravity her body was used to. And with that, the girl with wing and eyes that were like black holes that pulled at his souls left Remus' life. It was the start of the longest 3 months of his life. He threw himself into his writing, trying to forget that they had ever met. His Story Plaza page attracted readings and positive reviews, but his heart was heavy. Ethel joked that he was a hopeless cliché, the miserable artist creating great works. Alas, it was lost in the storm raging inside his head. He lost weight and gained muscle, surviving the days on shards of dreamless sleep and caffeine. It was during this period that he got neighbors. Nothing was located along an old road called U.S. Route 93 between towns called Wickenburg and Kingman. The governments of those two had petitioned the state to do major maintenance on the road. Most cargo was moved by teleporter these days, but those required a lot of power. And on relatively short distances, trucks with anti-gravity tracks were cheaper. The teleporters were also no good for private citizens who moved around with hovercars and hoverbikes, so they needed the road. The state agreed to remake the road, which led to Remus, who owned the 20 plots of land that officially made up the town, to get offers. He sold 3 plots, one for a fuel station, one for a diner, and one for a motel. He used the money to pay debts he had accumulated in what he called his years in hell. When he was done, he had $30 left, which he spent on a drawn portrait of Quinn. They began construction a week later, not that he noticed inside his tent. On the other side of the equation, Quinn was also miserable. She didn't understand why, but she missed Remus. The interstellar Paul people did what they could to make her feel better, but she had discovered that Earth was nothing like what they lab staff had told her. It was clear that they had lied to her to keep her in line. Now she wanted to know what the planet was really like, what humans were really like, and she wanted to do so with Remus, not some stranger in a suit. While all of this was happening, Mika finished putting together the Operation Hyperion case file. And then after 4 months, she went to her boss to ask for permission to proceed. He gave her the clearance she needed, and she sent copies of the proof everywhere. Courts, other law enforcement agencies, and politicians. And then everything went off the rails. Betrayal. Peter Wallace was furious. The courts and the agencies had wanted to go to Luna and start kicking down doors, but the politicians had decided humanity couldn't afford to lose diplomatic contact with half the galaxy. And so they pulled strings and ordered Operation Hyperion's findings buried. As Peter entered his office and slammed the door shut, he thought about the dirty deal his superiors had just struck. Humanity would get Iorian technology, and in exchange, the lab would be relocated from Luna to Charon. Basically, they had made a Faustian pact that could be summoned in that one and cursed sentence, "Not in my backyard." He wanted to scream, but he had his orders. Needing to think, he went into the small bathroom that came with him office. He washed his face and looked into a small mirror. Tired blue eyes lived under short blonde hair. He was as Caucasian as they came, looking way too pale to be considered healthy. It was something his ex-wife used to complain about a lot. Well, until she had taken the kids and moved to Mars, leaving him with nothing but an empty house and divorce papers. Then a knock at the door pulled him back to the here and now. "Enter," he said. Mika Jansen entered the office. Her face was filled with rage like his, but he didn't blame her. Luna was officially neutral territory, a holdover from the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, which was why he has ordered her to inform the political leaders she had. Now, he had just gone in and asked for forgiveness later. She asked the question they were both struggling with. "Are we just going to take this?" He wanted to say no, but part of him knew that there wasn't much they could do. Then he suddenly realized that there was one player who had not entered the game yet. A plan formed in his head. It was a crazy plan, but it was all they had, taking several deep breaths to calm down his head. Then he smiled mysteriously as he began explaining what he was cooking up. "Return to life." Quinn stepped out of the shuttle. Like Jansen and Wallace, she had been furious with Earth politicians. The interstellar Paul officers had done what they could for her, providing her with clothing and a bag, along with several days' worth of Iorian food. But in the end, there was nothing they could do about the fact that they had to put her on the streets. The Iorian Empire saw her as a freak or property, while the Dragon Federation hated her kind with a passion. So there was only one place for her to go. Which was fine with her, because he was the only person she trusted. And so she was back in nothing, Arizona. There were extra buildings on one side of the road, but the orange tent was still on the other, all by itself. She took a deep breath and knocked on the door. Remus opened the door. He looked disheveled, bearded, and haunted, but when he saw her, his eyes lit up and he smiled. "Quinn, you're back," he said, forgetting that he wasn't carrying his translator. Fortunately, Quinn had been to something to do to fill her time while with Interstellar Paul, so she had spent her time learning English, which was why she understood him perfectly now. "Yes," she said, accented English. "You look horrible." He didn't disagree with her, only offering her his hand. She took it and they went inside, and so Remus left the darkness. It started with a shave and a haircut, followed by new clothes, but the real transformation was between them. On the third day, she asked him to tell her about him again. And the dam broke. He told her about his parents, his distant mother and his demanding father. Captain Walter McKinley was from a long line of soldiers, and he expected his children to follow in his footsteps. Besides Remus, there were 3 more McKinley children. James was the oldest, who was 20 and in the Britannia Royal Naval College when his parents had thrown him out. Next came Paul, who had been 18 on that fateful day. He had been furious with his father. Remus had heard whispers that he had left the elderly house a week after he had been kicked out, but there had never been a way to confirm it. Finally, there had been Jennifer. Remus always called Jenny. She had been invisible to her father simply because she was a girl. The day he had been thrown out had been her 12th birthday. He had known it was not her fault. So he had kissed her on the forehead and told her he loved her before walking out. He had told her about his loneliness. about how people could be more foreign to him than actual aliens, about how people thought that being on the spectrum meant you had the intelligence of a cucumber, about how he wanted to yell at Dustin Hoffman and Tom Cruise for making that blasted movie Rain Man a long time ago, how he knew it was not their fault, but he hated the fact that any idiot with a keyboard and camera who had seen that movie thought that they had figured out autism. He told her about how scary looking into people's eyes was for him, about his caffeine addiction and nightmares, about his trouble keep fact and fiction apart, especially in a world that now that question of alien life had been answered was turning its attention to the question of the multiverse, about how on really bad nights he was haunted by vision of a world where the skies were burned orange over a citadel with a might glass dome, and the number 2.47 billion that floated through his head in moments like that. And how he had never shared these thoughts with anybody, not even in his stories. He could already hear the comment section on Story Plaza. Gee, dude, self-insert much, loser, and that was one of the nicer comments he could think of. The stellar web could be a cynical place. Quinn had listened to it all, hadn't judged, hadn't commented. Instead, she realized that he was another kind of torture soul, and realized that despite all he had gone through, he had still be kind. It had taken a pit of poking by Ethel, but that fire was still there. That had brought them closer together, which had manifested itself in a way they first found odd. They argued, but they realized that they had moved on from being polite to being honest and real. Remus had an old sleeping bag, which he used to sleep on the floor. He offered Quinn the bed. The old-fashioned chivalry had made her smile, and while she didn't like arguing, she did like making up afterwards. She also got a job once the dinner was finished. The owner, a kind, hard-working man called Rick, had needed help. Quinn and Daniel, Rick's son, and the dinner's cook had ended up in the kitchen. Daniel had taught her about Earth food, while she had taught him about Iorian dishes. Some had even ended up on the menu. The regular customers had always been respectful. Once, when a newcomer called Earl had insulted her, one of the regulars, a big burly man called Peter, had knocked him out with a single punch. That was the last time anybody had ever called her names. Quinn also started reading Remus stories. She asked intelligent questions, like why these stories often included human breeding with aliens, while that was extremely unlikely. When he told her that breeding drives subscriber counts, she laughed. She also wondered why the same names appeared again and again. He had only smiled at that one, and where were all the ugly aliens? She also noticed that there were not autistic aliens in these stories ever. Well, you're living with one, Remus had said with a wink, making her burst into laughter once again. For a while, she was able to forget about the lab. But then came the day that an Iorian freighter entered the Sol system. The news feeds didn't know why it was here, but Quinn and Remus did. It was here to relocate the lab. There was not doubt in Quinn's mind that the eggs they had harvested from her before she had been put in the pod were still up there, and she knew the timeline. By now, they were now doubt fully grown, and then something unexpected happened. Confession. Remus was in his sleeping bag while Quinn slept on the bed. They both woke to the sound of a spaceship landing. Remus was out the door first, grabbing a kitchen knife on his way out. If they were coming for her, he had no intention of going down without a fight. What they saw made them gasp. A small dragon shuttle was landing outside the small town. It was a sleek, small craft with room for 4 people, but there was only one person inside this craft. The Iorian Empire had created the Z Project to solve the immunity dangers. But the Dragon Federation had taken another approach. Instead of going to worlds themselves, they build advanced robots. These were based on the native life forms, but always had one thing that made it clear they were not locals. In the case of Earth, the diplomatic robots had blue skin instead of the normal human colors. There was only one of them, a male. He approached them and offered a passkey, which Quinn took. The robot stepped back and began to glow. Then it vaporized as if hit by a plasma bolt. "Now what?" Remus asked, Let's see what happens when we get in, Quinn said. They approached the shuttle and Quinn unlocked it. She got in the pilot's seat, while Remus took the co-pilot's chair. As soon as they were in place, a holographic screen appeared in front of them. Quinn gasped at the sight of an old Iorian in official green and yellow robes. He noticed that this Iorian was a lot more reptilian than Quinn. Something pinged in his head. He had just figured out why Project Z only used their subject for 3 years. The point of the project was to make Iorians immune to Earth microorganisms. But there was a species that was already immune to most of Earth microorganisms. They were called humans. Somehow, tiny shards of human DNA were hitching a ride with the adjustments the Iorians were making too. And after decades, it was starting to add up. The 3-year limit was probably the scientists trying to manage the issue. Then the old Iorian spoke up and broke his concentration. "This is Emperor Ayaz of the Iorian Empire," he said. Ayaz explained that the position of emperor had been a figurehead since the Earth year of 379 AD. Instead, the Iorian Empire was ruled by a group of oligarchs nicknamed the Shadow Cluster. The cluster thought he didn't know about Project Z, but he had secretly been waiting for a chance to shut it down. And when Peter Wallace and Mika Jansen had sent the Operation Hyperion files, Ayaz had seen his opening. So he had sent a Dragon stealth shuttle captured after a failed assassination attempt. He wished them good luck and the message ended. As soon as it did, Remus turned to Quinn. "Ready to go?" Remus asked. "They're my offspring, you don't have to go," Quinn said, looking at him. Suddenly, it was as if the shuttle was flooding with silence dissolved in water. Remus could hear his heart beating in his ears. They both knew that he had been utterly miserable when she had been gone, and that something had been growing between them since had returned. All of that was now coming to a final moment of decision, a moment that was scarier than anything else in his life. He took a deep breath and made his choice. "Quinn," Remus began, "I love you." His heart felt like a weight had been lifted from his chest. He took her hand. "And I'm not going anywhere. As far as I'm concerned, they're our offspring now." "I love you too," Quinn said. They kissed, and it was amazing. She was warm, soft, and tasted like strawberries. Remus made a mental note never to tell her that, not that he was afraid to connect to her. But Quinn had eaten strawberries once and spit them out, announcing that they tasted like puke. He figured it was because of her Iorian taste buds. Then the kiss ended. "Let's go get our kids," Quinn said. They turned to the controls. All the buttons were originally in the dragon language, but the Emperor had prepared well. Pieces of tape with writing in English and Iorian marked the most important ones. The shuttle blasted off, and Remus pushed a button simply marked stealth. If he'd been outside, he would have seen the ship cloak. "Going in." The ride through the atmosphere was short. It was only at this point that he remembered that the only weapon had to work with was a kitchen knife, but he had no intention of pointing that out. The shuttle was fast and the freighter had been traveling slowly in order not to attract attention. "Just another freighter on a random run," Quinn said. Remus nodded. He knew it was a big, fat lie, but it was a helpful lie. Because to pass as a regular freighter, the ship had shuttles with cargo going in and out, and that meant that the shuttle bays had to be open, which was the way in they needed. Part of his brain told him that this was far too easy. If this had been a movie, he would have groaned at the horrible plot point, or expect the heroes to be caught as soon as they stepped out of the shuttle. Quinn flew them into the bay and they landed. Looking around the shuttle for weapons, Remus found 2 energy pistols. He handed one to Quinn and they got out. They made it 5 meters before Iorian guards rushed into the shuttle bay. The guards were dressed in black, thick armor and carrying heavy-looking energy rifles. It took them less than a minute to surround them. "Are you kidding me?" Remus growled as the guards took their pistols and his knife. The guards led them out of the shuttle bay. As they passed the security station, Remus noticed a monitor. He couldn't read the writing, but it was clearly showing a network of pressure sensors. It was how the guards had figured out that they were aboard. The sensors had detected the weight of the shuttle as soon as it had touched down. They were led past cargo bays full of stasis containers. Inside the containers were female Iorians. He wondered how the eggs were fertilized without male subjects. Then they passed several scientists with blue marks on their arms. Remus had a feeling that this was the answer to his question. Finally, they were led into a small office, where an Iorian male in a lab coat was waiting for them. 2 of the guards remained, blocking the exit, while the rest left. The doctor was looking out the window, beyond which was a vast cargo bay full of stasis pods. Quinn recognized him, despite only have his reflection to work with, and the look on her face made Remus dislike him instantly. He figured that whoever this was, he was in charge of the Z project. "Welcome back, Z3R2A," the man said. "So you didn't just survive Earth, you came back." He turned around at last. "What were you planning to do if we hadn't caught you? Liberate all the subjects?" "That was the plan," Quinn said. "Then you are a fool," the doctor said with a snicker. "Take them to Cargo Bay 3 and execute them." "Your funeral," Remus said, totally bluffing. "But don't come complain to us when the Dragon Federation blows you and your little science project to pieces." The doctor gave him a look that made it clear he wasn't believing any of this. But Remus kept going. "We arrived in a Dragon stealth shuttle, genius. Those don't exactly grow on trees." A small crack formed in the doctor's arrogant attitude. "So, you tell me, who is backing up this little expedition? And how do you know that us getting captured isn't part of the plan?" The crack was getting bigger. "In fact, how do you know getting executed isn't part of the plan? She's been on Earth for months. You catch us, execute us, and a couple hours later, you all go H.G. Wells." Quinn realized what he was up to. After learning English, she had read a lot of books, including War of the Worlds. "All of your studies have been on pathogens in the living. What do you know about their corpse pathogens, their biological weapons programs?" "That is the thing about a planet with countries, Doctor. There's not just one government and one program, Doctor. There's dozens." That finally shattered the doctor's mask of certainty. "Take them to the medical bay," he ordered. "We'll examine them, but don't think you will survive. This is just a stay of execution." The 2 guards manhandled them roughly out the door. Remus knew that he had only bought them time, but then they were led into the medical bay. It was a futuristic room with what looked like a pair of dentist's chairs with some kind of scanners above them. There were several people in some kind of uniform walking around the place. Then, Remus spotted a chance. On the other side of the room was a big green button with some kind symbol on it. It was covered by a transparent lid, making it clear that this was some kind of emergency button. He looked at Quinn and realized she had also spotted it. And then the guards made a mistake. One of them kept his weapon trained on them, but the other walked over to what Remus presumed was the ranking doctor. The man was whispering something into the doctor's ear when Remus made his move. He slammed into the guard who had been pointing the weapon at them. They went down in a tangle of limbs and the guard's weapon went flying. Before the second guard could respond, Quinn ran for the button. She opened the lid and slammed it with the palm of her hand. The result was instant. Shutters slammed down, blocking all the windows and doors. What Remus hadn't known, but Quinn did, was that the symbol on the button was Iorian for contagious diseases. She had triggered the room's quarantine mode. None of this helped Remus, who was fighting the guard. The man was better trained than him, but he was fighting for his life. And when the chance came, he bit the man in his arm. The guard's blood tasted bitter, but it did the job and he went down like a sack of sugar cane. While this was happening, Quinn dodged several shots from the second guard. She made it to the rifle that had gone flying. Then she shot the guard who had been shooting at her before pointing the weapon at the medical staff. They raised their hands as Remus grabbed the rifle from the shot man. "What do we do with them?" Remus asked. "We put them in there," Quinn said, nodding to a glass door that didn't have a shutter over it. "It's a supply closet." Looking through the window, he realized that the closet had solid bulkheads, meaning that there was no way out. That was why there was no shutter over this door. They ushered the doctors into the closet, and Remus bashed the controls with the butt of his rifle, locking them in. That was when the shooting started. The security personnel outside the medical bay had apparently figured out what was going on, and they were trying to blast their way in. Looking around, Remus spotted an air shaft and opened it. By the time the guards finally blasted their way in, they were already out of the shaft in a room outside the quarantine. It was a supply closet full of uniforms, cleaning supplies and tools. They grabbed 2 of the guard uniforms and moved to another room. This one was a lab full of blood samples, and he knew what this was. When Quinn had talked about Project Z, she had told him that this was how they created the final product. The scientists took blood and transformed it into a serum, which was then injected into Iorian diplomats and spies. The sight of the samples made anger flare in his chest, but Quinn put her hand on his shoulder. It reminded him of why they were here. He turned his attention to the uniform, changing into it as best as he could. It was too big and there were holes for wings and a tail, but he made it work. Quinn looked like she was career security officer. They left the lab, just 2 more officers looking for the escaped fugitives. "Getting out." Remus' heart was pounding in his ears as they walked down the corridor. How had he, a hermit with issues, ended up running through an alien ship with his alien girlfriend? It didn't matter. After what felt like forever, they entered the large cargo bay they had seen from the office. There were guards running to and fro all around the place. They were just 2 more figures in a sea of people. It was only then that he realized that there were hundreds stasis pods in this cargo bay alone. Not to mention that they had passed several other cargo bays before getting to the project leader's office. How were they going to get all of these people out of here? Before he could come up with a plan, the voice of the project leader boomed through the ship. "Z3R2A, I have your offspring. Return to my office with your human, or I will execute them." "Something tells me that they will be. Even if we go," Remus said, his voice grim. "We need a plan, or this will end badly," Quinn said. Remus cursed under his breath. He looked up at the window where the project leader stood, and then spotted a pipe and followed it with his eyes. They lit up with amusement as the plan they needed formed in his hand. Quinn looked at him in surprise. She had never seen him like this. But she got the feeling that the Dr. Ramal, the project leader, wouldn't like what he was about to do one bit. "I'll go," Quinn began. "Whatever you do, make it fast." He nodded, and she began walking towards the office. It didn't take long for the guards to catch on. They took her rifle and aimed their own at her. She entered the office to find Ramal and 4 more guards. The guards' rifles were aimed at 6 Iorian females. They had Quinn's eyes, and their wings were the same color as hers. Around the wrists of their right arms were white armbands. On these were black letters and numbers, and she realized that these were their serial numbers. "Where's the human?" Ramal asked. "I don't know," Quinn answered. "So, Ramal, how do I know these are really my offspring, and not just 6 random subjects you've pulled from stasis?" Ramal smiled a cruel smile, then opened a drawer in his desk and took out a genetic scanner. He tossed it to Quinn. She activated the device and scanned herself. A blue holographic projection of her DNA appeared. Then she began scanning the other Iorian females, feeling the eyes of the guards on her back. The holographic projection changed as more DNA strands were added. Sections of the new strands were red, indicating their shared DNA. "Now," Ramal said, "tell me where the human is, or we will begin executing your offspring." She was about to yell that she didn't know when Remus was, when everything in the cargo bay went haywire. First, alarms began to scream, then lights on the stasis pods began to change to red, and after that, they began to open. Ramal grabbed a communicator and barked orders into it. But the genie was out of the bottle. Over the communicator, a panicked engineer reported that the cooling system for the stasis pods had gone offline. Quinn smiled and remembered how Remus had told her how when he had first moved in, he had not been able to use his computer longer than 20 minutes at a time. It turned out that the tent had been too hot, so he had added air conditioning to the tent. The stasis pods generated heat, and because they had been added to a ship that was never meant to hold them, they threatened to overheat the ship. So the Iorian technicians had improvised a cooling system. A cooling system that Remus had broken somehow, and that was now ruining Ramal's day. The doctor was still yelling into his communicator when they heard shooting outside, followed by the thump of bodies hitting the floor. 2 of the guards turned to the door, while the other 2 kept their weapons aimed on Quinn's family. She expected the guards to start shooting through the door. But then the ship jolted, as something important broke. 3 of Quinn's offspring jumped one of the guards, while the other 3 jumped the other. As this happened, Quinn punched Ramal with all the force she could muster. The doctor went down and she grabbed his energy pistol. At the same time, 2 shots came through the door, taking down the last 2 guards. The door opened and Remus stood there. Turns out these things come with infrared scopes. I found the right button, he said before turning to the offspring, who were looking at him like he had grown a second head. The silence was awkward, so he decided to speak up. "Hi, I'm Remus McKinley of Earth. Nice to meet you." One of the other ladies turned to Quinn and asked something in Iorian. Because they weren't carrying translators, Remus couldn't understand what they were saying. Quinn answered, and soon they were engaged in a heated conversation. As they did, Remus kept an eye on the corridor. It was only a matter of time before the crew or security realized they were here. In the end, the conversation ended with a sentence that Remus couldn't understand literally, but from the tone made out it be, "Because I'm your mother and I said so." The girls got off the 2 guards they had jumped. They were still breathing, but had been knocked out by hitting the floor. Quinn gave some short orders and they grabbed all the weapons they could. That done, they headed for the shuttle bay. They found it in chaos. Everybody's subjects, project staff and crew was scrambling to get off the ship. At the same time, an electronic male voice was announcing something in Iorian. Remus figured that somebody had given the order to abandon ship, which the computer was now announcing over the intercom. Fortunately, the chaos meant that the Dragon stealth shuttle they had arrived in was still parked exactly where they had left it. Remus and 3 of the offspring got into the shuttle, while Quinn and the others made their way to a cargo shuttle. Boarding was a mess and nobody realized that they weren't supposed to be there. The door closed behind them. 3 seconds later, the shuttle launched. Remus powered up the Dragon shuttle and followed it. Changes. The freighter had been between them and the moon. And because there was a serious risk of the ship going up like a Roman candle, Earth had been the only place for Quinn's cargo shuttle to land. As for the specific spot, their pilot had decided that Melbourne in Australia was the best place to hit soil. Remus had touched down in nothing. It had been far from a smooth ride, but they had gotten there in one piece. Then he had gone to collect Quinn and the others. She had bought a cell phone during her time in nothing, so it had only taken a call to figure out where she was. Quinn and the other 3 offspring had crammed into the Dragon shuttle. This time Quinn had done the flying. That was 3 months ago now. In those months, 3 invasions had taken place in Nothing, Arizona. Invasion number 1 had happened the next day. It had consisted of reporters. The escapees from the freighter had landed all over the planet. This had started the first cracks in the Earth-Iorian deal. And then Emperor Ayaz had shared the Operation Hyperion files with the press. The result had been explosive. Reporters had interviewed Project Z subjects, sources had stepped forward, and information had been dug up. For 2 days, nothing had found itself under siege by the media. Then the second invasion had happened. The diner's regulars led by Peter had chased out the reporters. They had made sure that no more reporters bothered them, but it was at this point that several government officials had arrived. Surprisingly, they weren't from the United States. They were from his original home of Scotland. They had wanted to buy the Dragon stealth shuttle, which Remus and Quinn had sold them for a small fortune. Some of this money was spent on construction materials. The regulars helped them build a basement underneath the tent. Said basement contained a proper kitchen and real bathroom. It was connected to the tent by a ladder. Remus also bought 2 extensions for the tent. Between these and the now empty section that had been the kitchen, they were able to create a proper bedroom. This included a bed big enough for the both of them. Phase 2 was the construction of 8 yurts. 1 for each of the offspring, and 2 that were connected to form a common area with toilet, a kitchen, and a living room. And that was just the first week. But the biggest change was that the offspring their girls picked their names. April, Mary, Clara, Victoria, Miri, and Erica. As they settled into their new homes, they slowly began learning about Earth costumes and languages. At the same time, Remus got a shocking message. It was an email from his brother James. Followed the next day by messages from Paul and Jenny. His siblings had been searching for him for years. Their mother had divorced their father 5 years ago and was now married to a man in Indonesia. She had never talked to her old family again. As for the captain, he had developed an alcohol problem after that. 2 years after the divorce, he had drunkenly wandered into a busy road and been hit by a truck. He'd been dead before the ambulance arrived. As for the siblings, Jenny was now a botanist on Mars. Paul had joined the Royal Army as an enlisted man to escape the elderly home. A fact that had made the captain furious. But Paul hadn't cared. He had not been a good soldier, but had graduated top of his class in explosive ordnance training. He had lost his right arm in the line of duty, but the Army had paid for a state-of-the-art prosthetic, and his service had continued. These days, he was a staff sergeant. The most ironic part of the message was James' own tale. He had done what was expected of him and become an officer in the Royal Navy. His climb up the ranks had been stimulated by his father, but not in the way the senior McKinley had wanted. James had seen his father and the people the captain admired as a clear example of how not to lead. Where his father had been named Bligh in the Naval College, he had been called Kirk. So when he had been promoted from the Royal Navy to the Global Defense Fleet, nobody had been surprised. He had been put in command of the deep space cruiser, HMS Lexington. A state-of-the-art vessel with a crew of 603, it was exploring the neutral zone between the Iorian Empire and the Dragon Federation. The Admiralty figured that since Earth had been overlooked, maybe there were other sentient species to be found there. He had been doing such a good job that he had been promoted to Commodore. Between the promotion and the transfer, his relationship with the captain had gone down in flames. There was, however, a happy end to James' story. He and Paul had reconnected by messages. Then, when James had been on Earth for shore leave, Paul had set him on a blind date with a woman called Kalani. Their chemistry had been instant. They had ended up getting married and now had 4 children. Andrea, Paul Jr., Remus Jr., and Samuel. Kalani and the children lived on Oahu, and that was where the original message had ended. Remus had sent a reply, telling Paul and James about his own adventure. It had been the first of a long chain of messages, video calls, and packages going back and forth. This was the start of the build-up to the third invasion. Remus and Quinn's relationship had deepened since they had returned from the freighter, so they had decided to get married, and they were not the only ones. Mary had fallen in love with Daniel, while his father Rick had become an item with a woman called Lynn. Lynn was the manager of Nothing's Motel, and thus they had begun preparations for the biggest party in the town's history. Said party had led to the third invasion, which was a massive influx of friends and family. The regulars had all been there, as had been all of Rick's family. Her children had to go to school that day, but Kalani had come, as had Paul and a large gaggle of Scottish McKinleys. Both the wedding and the party had been epic. Now, 3 days later, Remus and Quinn were sitting on their bed. The first night after the wedding, they had been exhausted, so they had slept and snored. After that had come a day-long hangover. And it was only now that they were feeling good enough to actually have a conversation. Remus put his arm around Quinn. "You know, this party is going to make a good story someday," he said with a smile in his voice. "Well, what little I can remember of it. The only thing missing is the mandatory breeding scene," Quinn said. She was smiling, but there was something sad there as well. "You know, our species are incompatible. We'll never been able to have younglings of our own." "I know, but I also know that family and love are about more than biology." Then he kissed her. Epilogue. Outside the tent, April made a face. From the sounds coming from the tent, it was clear that her parents were doing more than kissing. She headed for the common area. As she did so, she passed Mary and Daniel's yurt. They also sounded like they were busy doing things that April didn't want to know. Because of the distraction, she didn't notice the van and moving trucks parking next to the camp. As she entered the common area, Rick was baking pancakes and explaining that Pancake Tuesday wasn't some horror fest where humans pancaked and ate everything with a heartbeat. Said explanation was aimed at her remaining sisters. While they sat at the kitchen table, Kalani was reading a book in a nearby chair, and Lynn was doing something she had learned was called knitting. It was Lynn who noticed the look on her face as she sat down at the table. "Is something wrong, April?" she asked. "Mom and Dad are," she swallowed the rest of the sentence, not knowing how to say it. "Make bags?" Clara asked, causing April to frown. "What? Humans do babies, Iorians do eggs. If you combine the two, you get bags." "That's not how DNA works," Victoria said. The two sisters erupted into sibling bickering, while April sighed and buried her face in her hands. It was the touch of something cold and wet to her shoulder that made her look up. She found herself looking into the eyes of 35 kilograms worth of German Shepherd. And thus began Paul's story. But that is a story for another time. The end.